The Orioles, who have never given out a multi-year deal to a pitcher under Mike Elias, reportedly had one in place with Jeff Hoffman, but then he took his physical and reportedly it all fell apart. We'll talk about the ramifications from that, plus a waiver claim and maybe Santander coming back. That's all coming up on this jam-packed episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Sunday, January 12th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we're going to talk about the surprising news that came out on Friday after the Orioles has signed Andrew Kittredge to a one-year deal and the Blue Jays had signed reliever Jeff Hoffman to a three-year deal. It came out that the Orioles actually originally had a three-year agreement with Jeff Hoffman, and then they saw something in his physical they didn't like and canceled the contract. We'll talk about what that means moving forward. Then the Orioles made a waiver claim of an interesting right-hander, former top prospect Roansy Contreras. We'll talk about if he could help the Orioles bullpen or rotation. And finally, we got some interesting Anthony Santander news from Ken Rosenthal in The Athletic over the weekend, and why this development makes me think there's still a chance Santander is back in Baltimore in 2025. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. And new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed win or lose. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So we're going to kick off this episode with kind of an interesting piece of information that came in on Friday. Now, hopefully you joined us on Friday evening for the live show. If not, checked out the episode, our latest one, the Orioles signing veteran reliever Andrew Kittredge to a one-year, $10 million deal. Broke down that contract on Friday's pod. Make sure to go check that one out if you haven't listened. And of course, wherever you listen, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating and a review, that really helps out the show. And of course, if you're watching here on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. It certainly helps out the show. We broke down Andrew Kittredge, how he'll give the Orioles another veteran righty high leverage arm and has made their bullpen better heading into 2025. But not shortly after the Kittredge signing, but on the same day, Friday, it was reported that the Blue Jays had agreed to a 3-year, $33 million deal with right-handed relief free agent Jeff Hoffman. And Hoffman, who was a starter early in his career with Colorado and Cincinnati, and then caught on with the Phillies. They moved into the bullpen, and he became dominant. In the last 2 years, Hoffman was one of the best relievers in Major League Baseball. He became a free agent, and there were some talks this offseason, like maybe teams were interested in signing him and moving him back into a starting role. But either way, Blue Jays signed him, 3 years, $33 million. Ross Atkins, the Blue Jays GM, comes out after and says, basically, in so many words, we're excited for Hoffman to become our closer this year because they had non-tendered Jordan Romano, their old closer, as well. And so they apparently are signing Hoffman, at least for now, to be a reliever in that bullpen. And Hoffman was someone I haven't talked about a lot this offseason when kind of doing wish lists for free agents and previewing pitchers the Orioles could go after, because I wasn't sure what the O's were going to do with a guy like Jeff Hoffman. I felt like, hey, if they bring him in as a reliever, he's certainly going to help. But the free agent predictions for him in relief contracts were like 4 years, $40+ million. And I just didn't see the Orioles shelling out 4 years for a relief pitcher. They haven't done for a starter. I think they certainly wouldn't do it for a free agent reliever. And then I was like, on the starting end, well, he could be an interesting back-end starter for the O's where his fallback option is a reliever. That could be nice. But I was always like, I didn't know where to place him, reliever or starter. And I just kind of kept him out of my wish list while still mentioning him a couple of times on the show where, like, hey, his arm would help the Orioles in some way, shape, or form. So we get the announcement that the Blue Jays went and got him and they're going to use him as a reliever. And then about an hour later, we get a report from Robert Murray, their MLB insider over at Fansided, and Murray reports, and it has been corroborated, that the Orioles, before the Blue Jays signed him, had an agreement with Jeff Hoffman on a 3-year, $40 million contract. So similarly 3 years, but a little more money than the $33 million he got with the Blue Jays. And then, like every free agent contract, it gets reported, and then generally the team has to do a physical. Once the player passes that team physical, they sign the contract and the deal is official. Well, apparently, earlier last week, Hoffman had agreed to 3 years, $40 million with the Orioles. They either brought him in or they sent people there, team doctor, to do his physical. And reportedly, according to Robert Murray, the Orioles found something specifically in his throwing shoulder that made them hesitant. And now sometimes when you see that, you try and go back to the player and work out a shorter, cheaper deal. Sometimes what you see is so bad, you just want to cancel the deal altogether. There has not been reporting which of those things happened. It's possible that the Orioles just said, we don't want him at all after this shoulder. It's possible the Orioles said, hey, we're going to bump this down to like 2 years, $20 million after seeing your shoulder. And Hoffman knew he had better offers out there from the Blue Jays and said, well, I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to go with Toronto, which was actually his original organization before he was traded as a minor leaguer. So we're not sure which of those two things happened, but we do know the Orioles essentially either bumped down or canceled this deal because of an issue in his shoulder. And the Baltimore Banner and Murray both reported that once that deal fell through, the Orioles then pivoted to Andrew Kittredge and got him to sign a 1-year deal to still make an improvement to their bullpen on Friday. It just wasn't Hoffman, it was Kittredge. And this is interesting stuff. Now, the Orioles pivoting to Kittredge tells me that the Orioles probably, at least for this year, saw Jeff Hoffman and were going to sign Hoffman as more of a reliever than a starter for 2025. And that makes sense too, because of, even if Hoffman's going to be a good starter one day, again, he's 32 years old. You can't pencil him in to be a top of the rotation guy right now. I'm not saying he couldn't become that with his stuff, but it doesn't seem likely now. It seems like he's more of a back end starter. And the Orioles have accrued so much depth with Tomoyuki Sugano and Charlie Morton in their back-end starters that if they're going to add a starting pitcher at this point, as we've talked about, it's going to be a top-of-the-rotation guy. They don't have room for another back-end guy to add. So at this point, if they were going to add Jeff Hoffman last week, and this was after the Morton signing, it was going to be as a reliever, at least for now. So it makes sense that they pivoted to Kittredge and still got themselves a good right-handed reliever. And Hoffman as a reliever would have been an extremely good addition, if he's healthy, to this Orioles bullpen. He has been a lights-out reliever for the Phillies the last 2 years. Right-hander, now 32 years old, just turned 32 last week. And, he was with Cincinnati and Colorado as a starter, and he was just kind of okay. And then he came to Philly in 2023, and they turned him into something completely different. This year with the Phillies, 66 and a third innings, a 2.17 ERA for Hoffman, 34% strikeout rate, 6% walk rate. He was insane out of that Philly bullpen, moved into the closer role for at least part of the season, picked up 10 saves. He's been ridiculous. And among relief pitchers who have thrown at least a combined total of 100 or more innings over the past 2 seasons. So those are relievers who are generally trusted guys who stayed healthy, right? They threw 100 innings over the last 2 years. If you're hitting 50 innings in a season, you're a pretty good and trustworthy reliever. So among relievers who have hit 100 innings total over the past 2 years, Jeff Hoffman is 4th in strikeout minus walk percentage, 26%. That's a good number to look at. 6th in strikeout percentage itself at 33%. 5th in batting average allowed at just 178. 6th in whip at 0.94. 6th in ERA at 2.23. 3rd in FIP at 2.54, and 5th in FanGraphs WAR, worth 3.6 wins over those past 2 years. I mean, you can say it pretty much no doubt that Jeff Hoffman is a top 5 reliever in baseball right now. Showing, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, Hoffman's Baseball Savant page, courtesy of Baseball Savant and StatCast, like you can see he gets hit a little hard, and he's a fly ball pitcher more than a ground ball pitcher. But those are really the only 2 things against his game. You can see he's in the top 5 percentile on chase rate, on swing and miss rate, on strikeout rate, expected ERA, expected batting average. He throws 97, 98 with a fastball. He's got dominant wipeout slider, breaking stuff with a good changeup. Like, it is some serious stuff that Hoffman has, and he would have been a serious addition to this Orioles bullpen. Again, he's a no doubt top 5 reliever in the majors, but it's not that the Orioles, weren't willing to pay him money. That would be a different thing, and got outbid by someone else. No. They outbid the other teams. He was agreed to 3 years, $40 million with the Orioles. They clearly outbid other teams for probably the best, I would say the best reliever left on the market, but they also clearly saw something in that medical. And what I think is also interesting is that with the Orioles signing him to a 3-year deal, you would think with the Orioles and Mike Elias being kind of risk averse on signing pitching to long-term deals, if they were going to give out a deal to a pitcher for more than 1 year, I would think it would be a starter and not a reliever, because relievers are so volatile. Multi-year deals for them are even more risky. But here was my thought with Hoffman. Since they pivoted to Kittredge, I would think, okay, Hoffman was going to be a reliever for the Orioles, one of their late inning lockdown guys in 2025. But giving him a 3-year deal makes me think they may have actually wanted Hoffman to be a reliever this year and then a starter next year and possibly the year beyond that. Because remember, Clay Holmes, who's been a really good reliever with the Yankees the past couple of years, signed a 3-year deal with the Mets this offseason. The Mets are going to turn him into a starting pitcher. And after he signed with the Mets, it was reported that the Orioles were one of the few finalists for Clay Holmes before he signed with the Mets, and the Orioles were also interested in signing him and turning him into a starting pitcher. So it's something that the O's have considered with dominant relievers on the free agent market already this offseason. So if they were willing to do it with Holmes, you would think they'd be willing to do it with Hoffman. Now, at this point in the offseason, there wasn't a lot of space for him in the rotation, but you sign him, you get one more dominant relief season out of him. And then instead of bringing him in, in January, you get his entire offseason from 2025 to 2026 as an Oriole. So you can help control his entire offseason plan. And basically you can control transitioning him from a reliever back into a starter next offseason. That could have given really the Orioles the best of both worlds, because you think about their rotation. Currently, 3/5 of their rotation that's at least projected for opening day of 2025, they're going to be free agents after this year. Zach Eflin, Tomoyuki Sugano, and Charlie Morton are all due to be free agents after the 2025 season. Now, of course, the O's will have Kyle Bradish back and have Tyler Wells back and maybe take steps forward from Cade Povich and Chase McDermott, and maybe Trevor Rogers gets it back together. Like, there will still be starters on the roster for 2026 and beyond. But that year is when you'd really have the opening for starting pitching. And maybe that would have been the plan with Hoffman all along. Instead, though, you get this failed physical. And overall, from the Orioles side, if you see an issue with a pitcher's arm, shoulder, elbow, whatever it is, and actually for long-term play, shoulder has actually become a bigger issue in terms of long-term effectiveness than elbow has for pitchers. Now, there's more elbow injuries than shoulder injuries, but shoulder injuries generally are harder for pitchers to come back from at this point than the elbow is. So that's why the shoulder may have even been a bigger issue. If you see an arm issue for a pitcher, it's generally not worth the risk for an already risky and already risk-averse team in the Orioles to do a 3-year deal. If you think he's going to be injured for a chunk of that, it's not worth it to bring him in. And the Orioles do have a history of this. It was all with the previous regime and Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter and that medical team. But the Orioles had a reputation for a long time of basically having the toughest physical to pass for free agents. And we saw it bubble up with Grant Balfour, if you remember this one. In 2013, he was the dominant closer with the A's. The Orioles wanted to sign him. Then there was a leak about a issue with his medicals. He ends up signing with the Rays and honestly wasn't very good after that. Then there was Tyler Colvin, the outfielder, who they tried to sign in 2014. There was a medical issue there. He ended up playing one more terrible season in the big leagues and was out of the major leagues 1 year later. So the Orioles were justified in those two moves on the failed physicals because, again, Balfour and Colvin, although they'd been good before, were not good after they failed their physicals with the Orioles and played in the major leagues for a little bit longer. So they would have ended up not being good signings for the Orioles if they had gone through with it. And clearly they saw something because it popped up for both of those players injury-wise and performance-wise after that. So it is going to be very, very interesting to monitor Jeff Hoffman. Now, it's going to be easier because he's going to be in division. Pitching for Toronto, Orioles play the Blue Jays 13 times next year. Hoffman's going to be a back-end dominant reliever. They're going to probably face Jeff Hoffman 4, 5, 6 times, I would think, in 2025 and beyond, right? It's a 3-year deal still that he signed with Toronto. So it's going to be very, very interesting to monitor two things with Hoffman. One, his health, specifically the shoulder. Like, if he goes on the IL with a shoulder issue at any point next year and misses more than like the minimum 2 weeks, I think the Orioles are kind of justified in that. And even if he doesn't go on the IL, it's going to be interesting to watch his performance, because if Hoffman stays healthy next year and pitches to the level out of the pen that he has shown his last 2 years in Philly, the O's are going to have to eat an L on that one. But if Hoffman either ends up on the injured list, has to get surgery, or even just has his production kind of fall off, even if he stays on the active roster and doesn't go on the IL, it'll kind of show out what the Orioles potentially saw in that medical. So it's going to be really interesting to keep an eye on. And listen, if the plan was what I think it was, which was relief pitcher in 2025, potentially starter in 2026, I would, for 3 years, $40 million for Jeff Hoffman, I would have been so on board with that deal. If he was healthy, you get a dominant reliever this year, and then you could turn him into a really useful starter beyond that. It would have been like a perfect deal for the Orioles. And it's unfortunate. And we don't know all the details for this entire process, and the Orioles looking at the physical and basically the deal falling through. But I would have loved to see him join this team. I mean, even with Felix Bautista, there's still questions about him coming off Tommy John. I think a healthy Jeff Hoffman steps in and immediately would have become the Orioles' best reliever in 2025, at least until we saw Felix Bautista prove that he's back to normal after the surgery. But then if you get that, you get a 1-2 punch of Hoffman and Bautista back there, along with Cano and Dominguez and Soto. And that would have been a dominant back end of the bullpen. But we'll never know what that medical showed. We really don't. And this isn't just an Orioles thing. Yes, they've had that reputation over the years, but just last year, before the Tigers traded our old buddy Jack Flaherty to the Dodgers, they had an agreement to actually trade him to the Yankees at the trade deadline. But the Yankees did the physical, saw something they didn't like in the medical reports, and backed out of the trade. Now, the Dodgers saw, you would think, the same things, but were okay with it. And Flaherty pitched fairly well for the Dodgers down the stretch. But every team kind of approaches this in a different way. And that's why the Orioles had that reputation. It seemed like they were the toughest on physicals, where some teams are a little looser and say, hey, you know what, we'll risk it. The Orioles seem to be very risk averse in that situation. But overall, to kind of cap things off of the Hoffman thing, and I know I've gone 17 plus minutes on segment number 1, but this is really interesting news to get out of Friday. Overall, I think it's nice to know that the Orioles we pretty much know at this point, they have offered a 3+ year deal to at least 2 and probably more free agent pitchers so far this offseason. We know there was an agreement on a 3-year, $40 million offer for Jeff Hoffman. We have that reporting. We know the Orioles made a competitive offer that was somewhere between $160 and $200 million for Corbin Burns. And at that point, you're not offering someone 2 years, $160 million. So you would think that deal was probably 3 or 4 years, if not more. I mean, so at this point, you can do the math in your head and be like, yeah, that was a 3+ year deal that they offered. And we also know that the Orioles were a finalist for Blake Snell. You would think they offered a guy like that at least 3 years if they were considered a finalist. And they were also a finalist for Clay Holmes, who signed a 3-year deal with the Mets. And it's possible that the Orioles only offered him a 2-year deal. That's certainly a possibility. But they were at least in the running, so maybe their deal was 3 years as well. Again, they didn't get any of those guys. At the end of the day, you got to get some of those guys to make it count. But before David Rubenstein, Mike Elias wasn't even, there were murmurs that he maybe offered a couple of pitchers 2-year deals, but beyond that, there was nothing even in the offer category of the Orioles wanting to go multiple years for pitchers. So it's nice to know, with a little more financial stability from the owner, they are willing to expand things, and hopefully at some point someone takes that money and they get that deal done. But as I mentioned, the Orioles ended up pivoting. They get Andrew Kittredge on that 1-year deal instead of Jeff Hoffman. And they also, over the weekend, added another interesting relief arm on waivers. I'll tell you about Roansy Contreras coming up after this. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. Now, you can go to FanDuel right now, and as I'm recording on Sunday afternoon, we don't yet know who the Ravens will be playing in the divisional round, whether they will be hosting the Texans or going to Buffalo. But I told you that 9+ point margin. I said the Ravens are going to cover that. And that they did with a 14-point win over the Steelers. So honestly, I'm blindly taking the Ravens in the divisional round as well over at FanDuel. And you just have to visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So moving on from Jeff Hoffman, we turn our attention to another reliever that the Orioles actually got on Friday and over the weekend, and that is right-handed pitcher Roansy Contreras, who was claimed off waivers by the Orioles from the Cincinnati Reds. Infielder Livan Soto was DFA'd to make room on the 40-man roster because it was full with 40 players before that move. Andrew Kittredge, that move has still yet to be officially announced. You hope maybe there's not any issues with his physical, but that has not become official as of my recording here about 1 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday. But it's been a crazy offseason so far for Roansy Contreras, the right-hander who is now 25 years old. It'll be his age 25 season next year. Quite an offseason. October 31st, after finishing the season with the Angels, he gets DFA'd by the Angels and shortly after is claimed by the Rangers. Then on December 12th, he's DFA'd by the Rangers. On December 19th, he's claimed by the Reds. On January 6th, he's DFA'd by the Reds. And on January 10th, he is claimed by the Orioles. And that is where Contreras sits now. So on one hand, he's not guaranteed a spot on anybody's roster. But on the other hand, a lot of teams want him and like what they see from Contreras. So let's talk about who he is. 25-year-old right-handed pitcher who is a former top prospect with both the Yankees and the Pirates. Signed as an amateur internationally out of the Dominican Republic with the Yankees at age 16 in 2017. Was making his way up through the minors, was a solid pitcher, and was traded by the Yankees along with 3 other prospects to the Pirates in January of 2021 in the Jameson Taillon trade. Now, Contreras from there broke out onto the scene. In 2021, he got into the Pirates system, and he was awesome. Was just dominant at Double-A, got called up to Triple-A to make one dominant start, and then got called up to the big leagues to make a start right at the end of the year, just a 3-inning scoreless start for the Pirates right at the end of the 2021 season. That's how good he was in 2021. In Double-A, he had a 2.65 ERA in 12 starts that season with a 35% K rate and a 5% walk rate. He was insane. And the Pirates were like, we've got something special here. Heading into 2022, he was, at the time of the trade, he was like the number 15 prospect in the Yankees system. Well, at the beginning of 2022, FanGraphs jumped him all the way up to a top 2 prospect, I believe, in the Pirates system. And he was the number 41 ranked prospect by Eric Longenhagen of FanGraphs in all of baseball heading into the 2022 season. That's how much helium he had as a pitcher. And honestly, 2022 was his first full MLB season, and he pitched pretty well. He made 18 starts, 95 innings, posted a 3.79 ERA for the Pirates. Like, his strikeout stuff wasn't as good. He had some issues, but he was 22 years old, and that was a really good first MLB season for a 22-year-old. And I think the Pirates were still feeling really good about him heading into 2023. Like, he looked like a cemented starter for them for years to come. It was a 4-seam fastball at 96. It was an awesome slider, good curveball, interesting changeup. He had a nice mix from the right side. He was only 22, and then it all fell apart in 2023. Again, he was only 23 years old, but he took a gigantic step back. He made 11 starts to begin the year and had an 8.22 ERA in those 11 starts. The slider and the curveball were still good, but his 4-seam fastball, still throwing 95, 96, got destroyed. Opponents hit 381, 598 slugging, 93 mile per hour average exit velocity against his 4-seam fastball. So they moved into the bullpen just to give him like a little bit of a break, see if he could pitch better out of there. And he was better out of the bullpen. He had a sub 4 ERA in the bullpen versus the 8+ ERA he had as a starter. But stuff still was not working. Strikeouts were consistently going down. And the Pirates sent him down to AAA in July, and he did not return to the big leagues for the rest of the 2023 season. And at that point, not only had the Pirates sent him to AAA, they had also exhausted all of his option years. So he came into 2024 competing for an opening day roster spot, which he did end up getting on the Pirates roster, but he was out of options, which would have made it really tough if he continued to struggle. And he was better in 2024. Like he was not worse. It was hard to be worse. He pitched 12 games out of the pen, 16 innings, had a 4.41 ERA. He was definitely better, but the walks were going up. The stuff was going down. He added a sweeper. The slider was still okay, but the fastball wasn't missing any bats. The velo was down to 94. It was getting killed. And the Pirates wanted to call up Paul Skeens in May. And it was kind of a funny, like, handing off of the torch, like, hey, Contreras, you were supposed to be our future ace. You're not much now. And they DFA'd Contreras to make the move to call up Paul Skeens in May to make his major league debut. And Contreras found himself getting claimed by the Angels, and the Angels stuck him immediately into the bullpen. And he did pitch differently. I don't know if I'd say better. He pitched a lot more. He threw 37 games, 52 innings with a 4.33 ERA in the Angels bullpen. Now his walk rate went down. He got it back down to like 10%, which is a little more doable. But the strikeout rate dropped to 18% with the Angels, the lowest of his career. And the underlying numbers still basically looked just as bad, if not worse sometimes, than they did as it was falling apart in Pittsburgh. His velocity did go up to 95, and his four-seam fastball kind of became usable again out of the bullpen. He dropped his sweeper, went down to his OG slider, but it wasn't as good anymore. The stuff plus numbers still look good, so there's something there. Now, he finally added a sinker to the mix. Like, when your four-seam fastball is getting killed, you got to add a sinker at some point, and he did that, but that got hit too. He was just kind of at best an okay reliever, but wasn't missing bats, wasn't missing strikeouts. It looked like he lost all of his upside. So he gets DFA'd and claimed by a million teams. Now he's with the Orioles. So why would the Orioles want this guy? That's probably a good question, because you're thinking, like, wasn't this guy just an absolute mess? Like what does he even throw there? Well, there's still something there with that stuff. His slider and his curveball are still good breaking pitches, just seem to lose the shape and really lost the command of those pitches this year. If they can figure out between the four-seamer and the sinker a fastball that's going to work better for Contreras and potentially get him to throw some of both of them, he could at worst still be a good reliever. And listen, he's only 25. There's still time to turn him back into a solid starting pitcher if the Orioles have time to do that. Now, he is out of options, as I mentioned, so there's not a great chance he survives the entire offseason on the Orioles 40-man roster. They make another move, he might be the next guy potentially to get DFA'd. And honestly, there's a chance that if this, say on Monday, the Kittredge signing is made official, the Orioles have to make a 40-man move, there's a chance they just DFA Roansy Contreras to make that move. But what they're trying to do here, and they've done it with players in the past, remember they did it with Ryan O'Hearn a couple off seasons ago. They got him, they immediately DFA'd him, but he cleared waivers, they kept him in the org, and now look at Ryan O'Hearn. That's probably the plan with Contreras. At some point later this offseason, they're going to DFA him. And because this time on waivers, hey, he got all the way to the Orioles, right? Orioles have a good record, which means they're near the back of the waiver order. He made it all the way to the Orioles. In the O's mind, it's like, if we DFA him again, theoretically, he's going to pass through all the teams ahead of us because they didn't want him last time. He only has to pass through 4 or 5 more teams to get to the end. And then if he clears waivers, we can send him to AAA, take him off the 40-man, but keep him in our organization, stash him in AAA Norfolk this year, and try and find that 22-year-old pitcher that was dominant in the minors and really, really good in his first year with the Pirates. And again, you may think, like, okay, why would the Orioles even want to go through that trouble with this guy? Well, the Pirates have been solid at developing pitching, and remember how good he was and how good, again, this was not that long ago, the number 41 prospect in baseball with good stuff, and he's still only 25 years old. Like, there's a lot of upside still left in Contreras, but also you got to remember, most of the innings he threw in the last year were for the Angels. And there's nobody I probably trust less in pitching development, maybe besides the Rockies, than the Los Angeles Angels. Like, they just don't know what to do, it seems like, with any of these guys on the mound. And you can see right here, if you're watching the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, this is Roansy Contreras' pitch mix, but also his locations for each of those pitches. This is courtesy of Baseball Savant and StatCast. And you can see, like, if you're looking on the Locked On or on the YouTube page, the changeup. It's just like he's throwing it everywhere. The red zones are where it's thrown the most. There's barely any red zones. Like, the changeup is everywhere. Look at the sweeper. It's everywhere. Look at the curveball. It's everywhere. It's like he has no plan. And sometimes guys can get away with throwing the ball everywhere if they have good command, but he didn't have great command. He's just spraying the ball everywhere with no plan of attack at all. And you might say, Connor, well, how does this compare? Well, let's take a look at the same chart for Yennier Cano, at this point, a proven late inning, high leverage major league reliever. Look at Cano's plan. Look at the sinker, right? He's got a plan where he's going to throw it. Look at the changeup. His plan, down and away, to lefties. Every single time, that's where that changeup is going. Look at the four-seam plan, up in the zone all the time for Cano. He's got a plan, and he executes that plan most of the time. Flip it back to Contreras, it looks like there's no plan out there. And I think what the Orioles can give him, there's other things to work on, but a plan on the mound, I think, is just going to help him. And if they are able to DFA him, pass him through waivers, and get him into AAA where they really have time to work with him, I think there's still a chance that the O's can fix him at 25 and he can still be a good relief pitcher. But he's going to end up on waivers again. So there's also the chance someone else claims him. But I hope and the Orioles hope he will stick around. But we've still got one more piece of news to get to here, because Anthony Santander, I think we've all kind of come to the conclusion, he's not coming back to Baltimore, right? Well, I don't know about that anymore. I think there's still a chance. Talk about why to finish off the show coming up next. So the Orioles, pretty early in the offseason, back in early December, signed Tyler O'Neill to a 3-year deal with an opt-out after 1 year. He's a right fielder. He had a good season in 2024. It seemed like the writing was on the wall. Hey, this is the cheaper, younger Anthony Santander replacement. The O's are not going to bring back Santander. And that's what it seemed. He was asking reportedly for 5 years and more than $100 million. I don't think the Orioles were willing to give him $100 million or were even willing to give him 5 years. So the writing was on the wall. He was going to be gone. And then the offseason has continued, and we are now at January 12th as I'm recording, and Santander is still unsigned, and he is currently one of the best free agents who is still out there on the market. And it is quite interesting at this point. Santander is still out there, and we got some reporting, I believe it was last week, that there was potentially an offer of around 4 years and $80 million on the table from the Blue Jays to sign Santander. There was also reporting that the Angels were highly interested in bringing in Santander as well. And at this point in the offseason, if he's getting offered 4 years, $80 million by at least a somewhat competent Blue Jays team, you would think he would take that. But I got to say, if he's got offers from the Angels and the Blue Jays out there that are clearly better than anything the Orioles or some other teams are going to be willing to give him, like the O's are not willing to give him 4 years, $80 million. I'll tell you that right now. I have this is not from reporting, this is more of a hunch. I've got a feeling that Santander wants to come back to Baltimore. And maybe for a while that wasn't in the cards, but maybe it is now, because Ken Rosenthal and Will Salmon combined to report and write a story in The Athletic on Saturday that was a lot of MLB news. And the big part of it was that Pete Alonso reportedly is willing to take a shorter-term 3-year deal with opt-outs to potentially come back to the Mets. And it seems like that's what might happen for Alonso at this point. But they also talked about in the article how Alonso at this point in the offseason, we've turned to January, is not the only high-profile free agent who's still out there who is willing to take a shorter-term deal with higher dollar figures each year with opt-outs and then potentially re-enter the free agent market next year. And the other two big names they mentioned that are reportedly at least open to this idea are Jack Flaherty and Anthony Santander would be open to potentially a short-term high AAV deal. Now, Santander, it seems like maybe being hurt on the market by having the qualifying offer, being hurt by the low on base percentage. Flaherty probably hurt by teams who saw him struggle for a while, then have one good year. Probably want to see him have a second good year before guaranteeing him a long-term deal, because Flaherty reportedly is also looking for something like 5 years, and teams just aren't willing to give that much commitment to Flaherty or Santander, it seems like, in free agency at this point. So each guy could be open to taking a deal that looks like something like 2 years, 50 or 60 million with an opt-out after the first year, where if they continue to perform well and prove that they can do it again and again, they opt out, they re-enter the free agent market next year, and hopefully then, while they're still fairly young, Flaherty would be 30, Santander would be like 31, they can still get their long-term deal. That is their goal, you would think, if they are open to this. And the big thing for Flaherty would be proving for another year, but the big thing for Santander would be you can't be offered the qualifying offer more than once. So if he came to another team on a short deal, opted out of his contract, re-entered the free agent market next year, he would not be able to have a qualifying offer offered to him, which means you wouldn't have to give up the draft pick if you signed him next offseason. And that does, as it does for the Orioles, we know, scare some teams away from signing players if they have that draft pick compensation attached to them because of the qualifying offer. And I truly think he wants to come back to Baltimore. And I think the Orioles, while not willing to give him a long-term deal, I think even with Tyler O'Neill in the fold, I think would be and should be willing to shell out 2 years, $50 million with an opt-out after year one for Anthony Santander. I think they should be and could be totally open to that deal. And you might think, Connor, they haven't traded any of their hitters. They signed Tyler O'Neill. They signed Gary Sanchez. Like, where is the room for Anthony Santander if they did bring him back? Like, how would this leave at bats for everybody? Well, I'm going to show you the projected lineups I talked about on this podcast a couple of weeks ago. This is the lineup I project versus right-handed hitters for the Orioles. Colton Cowser in left, Westburg at third, Gunnar Henderson at short, O'Hearn at first, Adley behind the plate, Kjerstad DH, O'Neill in right field, Holliday at second base, and Mullins in center field. And then here is my lineup against left-handed pitchers. You can see it if you're watching on the YouTube channel. But Westburg at second, Adley DH, Gunnar at short, O'Neill in right, Mountcastle at first, Cowser in center, Urias at third, Sanchez catching, and Jorge Mateo in left field. But to me, I feel like there's still openings for a bat in both of those lineups. You look at this lefty lineup, and as much as I love Jorge Mateo and he can hit lefties, you can just immediately throw Anthony Santander into this lineup. He plays right field, Tyler O'Neill plays left field, and you move Santander up in that order. You've got an even more dangerous attack against left-handed pitchers, and they are not going to be happy facing the Orioles. But even in the righty lineup, which looks a lot better and looks kind of stacked 1 through 9, even if you want to play Cedric Mullins, now you could say Cedric Mullins becomes a bench player and you put Santander in the outfield that way. But even if you want to play Mullins, I know we love Heston Kjerstad, but Santander at this point is a better hitter than Heston Kjerstad. So you throw him in at DH instead of Kjerstad, you still got a good lineup. You could sit O'Neill against some righties and throw Santander in there in right field. You've got a better lineup at that point with Santander in there. But the other thing is, like, yes, they could find a way to get him in with this current roster. But the other thing it would do, if you sign Santander, even if it was for a short-term deal, it makes some other hitters like Heston Kjerstad, like Kobe Mayo, like Ryan Mountcastle more expendable in trades. We know that all of those guys are guys that are at least being talked about when teams call the Orioles and Orioles call other teams potentially trying to trade for starting pitching. We know Kjerstad, Mayo, and Mountcastle are always at least at some point coming up in those trade discussions. Even Cedric Mullins, who was in discussions at the deadline last year, becomes a little more expendable. If you feel Cowser can play center field, you have Mateo who can play center field, and then O'Neill and Santander are in your corners. And when you add to the fact that the Orioles have signed Sugano and Morton and gotten a lot of back-end depth, we talked about it last week after the Morton signing, it made the Orioles more likely to include a young pitcher in a trade that might get them a proven veteran starting pitcher, because they have space for it now while signing Sugano and Morton to kind of lock down the back end of the rotation. So if you were to sign Santander, it makes, again, guys like Kjerstad, Mayo, and Mountcastle a little more expendable in your lineup. And you're also now willing to move one of Cade Povich or Dean Kramer in a trade because you can backfill them much easier because of Sugano and Morton and other guys like that. Now, all of a sudden, you've got between all those players, you can throw Chase McDermott in there and throw Cedric Mullins into that mix of guys that could be more easily dealt. You all of a sudden have these packages of players, some major leaguers, some prospects knocking on the door. And that's not even to include the younger guys the O's have in the system that other teams may be interested in. With those top level, major league type players, I think for a team that is trading away pitching but is still trying to compete, you have a mix of players and a prospect package and a player package that I don't think could be beat. Like, I think with those players available, now that you've added Morton and Sugano, and if you do add Santander, you could trade for really anyone. Like, think about the Padres with Dylan Cease, or the Mariners with Castillo, or the Astros with Framber Valdez, or the Twins with Pablo Lopez. All of those teams theoretically still want to compete and try to get to the playoffs in 2025. They are maybe moving those players to either get better on another side of the roster or shed some money to spend it elsewhere, or just shed some money in general, or they're pending free agents who they know they're not going to sign and they're looking to get something for them before they leave for nothing. All those teams are going to be looking for major league type talent back in a trade because they're still trying to compete. When you have Mayo, Kjerstad, Mountcastle, Povich, Kramer, all potentially expendable and have already all debuted, and a good chunk of that group is already proven in the big leagues, that is a pretty enticing package for one of those teams. And if you did get Santander, not only could you make your team better right now, I think, just like the Morton deal did, make it more possible to make a big deal for a impact starting pitcher. And imagine a scenario where the Orioles sign Santander, they've signed Morton and Sugano. It allows them to trade a package of like Dean Kramer and Heston Kjerstad to go get 3 years of top of his game Pablo Lopez. You add Santander and Pablo Lopez to what they've already done, that turns into a pretty outstanding offseason, the first one for David Rubenstein plus Mike Elias and the Orioles. Again, the Corbin Burnes trade didn't happen until February 1st. There is still plenty of time in this offseason. I think A, it's now possible again the Orioles could bring back Santander, and B, I think that move could open up even more trade possibilities for the Orioles to really get kind of the last thing missing on this roster, which is a top of the rotation starting pitcher. John Mioli wrote a good column in the Baltimore Banner this week about how all these Orioles little moves make sense, but he feels like they're all leading up to something bigger this offseason. I think a Santander move could be another smaller thing that leads up to the big prize, which I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's something else that could make you better and make you more likely to get a trade done that makes you better. Maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but that could turn into almost an ideal offseason if the Orioles were able to pull off some of those things. But let me know in the comments here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, would you like the Orioles, if he's willing to take a 2-year deal, even with the roster now, to bring back Santander? And then who do you think is expendable in a trade a little bit more if the Orioles do bring back Santander, even if it is on a 2-year deal? But that'll do it for today's episode. Had a lot of interesting news to get to, so figured drop it on a Sunday instead of the usual Monday. And because of that, we'll be back on Tuesday instead of Wednesday to get you some more Orioles chatter. We'll talk a bit about Cade Povich, right? He's a name I keep bringing up that potentially could be traded or potentially could help the Orioles rotation or potentially the Orioles bullpen. I wanted to break down his first season in the big leagues in 2024, what he did for the O's at the end of the year, and if he sticks around, what he could do in 2025. So unless we get more Orioles news, that Cade Povich episode is coming up on Tuesday. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.